Black Cats Run podcast. I'm Tristan Black Ingersoll. This is Black Cats Run. Preparation is the biggest limiter to performance, probably in sports and in everything else, basically. And when we look at preparation in endurance sport, that's the biggest limiter to performance. What is, if anything, the limiter or biggest limiter to preparation? The answer, I think, is fatigue. In today's episode, we talk about some concepts of fatigue. I'm going to suggest some models of how we can use some concepts from game theory to understand fatigue and concepts like overtraining and how culturally we're pressured to recognize overtraining as actually the norm of preparation for performance rather than the exception. Let's get into today's episode. There's a difference between training model and training practice. And I think that this difference is probably something that should more or less go without saying. Like, there has to be disconnect between models and practice. I think that's just kind of going to be inevitable because the reality that we're navigating presents different circumstances and variables that are going to limit our ability to implement anything, no matter how well designed it is. But we're also faced by the reality that our expectations of what is a good training model and how that training model should relate to practice towards performance, right? Preparation, practice is the active preparation towards performance. Say that 5 times fast. That modeling in and of itself is sometimes what's emphasized, but we're defining the value and the benefits of models largely based on constructed notions of what training should and shouldn't look like. And there are empirical ways to look at, evaluate, and be more sort of rationally deterministic about what training models should look like. But I think that it would be extremely difficult, and I'm going to hypothesize that it's impossible to get to the point where you can ever develop a model that is really ultimately highly executable. And I think this is one of those things that tends to sort of cause, coaches to ultimately kind of like lose in the sense that of maintaining a long-term process with any given athlete. And there's other reasons for that too. Like, athletes lose interest. Athletes develop different perspectives on what they feel they should be doing. But setting those things aside, ceteris paribus here, I think that, it's impossible to create a model that is going to exactly be what is appropriate for practice. And I think one of the big sort of overarching reasons for that has to do with fatigue. And because fatigue, I think, is really something that we can say basically means what prevents us from being able to do what we plan to do, even when that's been, reasonable. So it could be unreasonable, right? And an example of an unreasonable planned expectation could be to run mile repeats in 4 flat. Okay, or to do 2 times 20 minutes at 700 watts on the bike. Right? There are certain things that are unreasonable, right? And so why is that unreasonable? Well, because the fatigue that you're going to develop as you start to try to do that effort is so significant and overwhelming, you can't do it, right? But we can also see fatigue develop from a different perspective, right? Where fatigue can be sort of a cumulative thing where you start out doing things that are manageable and reasonable, and then you subsequently experience a process of breakdown. And I think a lot of people have experienced this individually, probably at different points, where you feel like you're getting in quote unquote worse shape over the course of a season. And it's not that you're really getting in worse shape, because, and one way we can sort of prove this is that oftentimes, if we actually take a substantive period of like non-effort, right? Not necessarily, it doesn't have to be literally non-activity, but it could be, but really just non-effort level of activity. And that might be as short as 3 to 5 days, maybe, less than a week, could be 2 weeks. And then athletes go out and they suddenly do the performance that they couldn't do all season. And I think sometimes that's explained away as, well, they couldn't handle the pressure at the time and they weren't mentally tough. And well, I think it really has to do with a mismanagement of fatigue, right? And that, by the way, even if you wanted to try to lean into the argument that the fatigue is psychocognitive, I just don't think that has substance to it, because what's the reality here? The reality is that the mind is a physical entity, and you're inducing fatigue, or fatigue that's induced from, other places outside of training, which are perfectly legitimate and not always possible to control, right? But a part of like the skill of being a good athlete or a coach is trying to develop strategies that anticipate possible inputs of fatigue from the training, but also from circumstances that exist outside of the training, and then thinking about how you can mitigate those, or sometimes, if you're really clever, finding ways to perhaps eliminate those completely. And when we look at this stuff, right, from that perspective, like there's always going to be a limit to that strategic capacity to get this stuff to be managed. So there's always going to be some level of fatigue. And, this idea that performance is proportional to investment is something that I want to kind of explore. And I'm going to, bring up repeatedly through this episode. And, probably there will probably be a second episode, but we'll see where this goes. But that's, I think, going to be a common theme and a common lever of understanding of like, and where do we see our expectation of proportionality, where the more I put in and the more immediately I invest, the more, I see that return. And actually, if you look at, ironically enough, if you look at patterns of investment, that initially what you put in an investment process is most responsive to the investment, but then eventually, just sort of like the compounding interest, the sort of like cascading effect, if you will, of that becomes such that just the like accumulative rolling effect of that interest from that just sort of dwarfs that immediate investment. And I think that in athletics too, I think this idea that if we do something over a 3 to 4 week period, that we're going to then at the end of the 3 to 4 weeks, see a significant benefit, I think is not always really there. And I know that I've posted some stuff on our Instagram at Black Cats Run. You can go there and check that out if you want to see this. I've shown some of my growth, I guess you would say, in lactate threshold and running since the beginning of July this year. And I think that that's substantive and significant. But I think the scale of improvement that you need to make in that kind of stuff to really start to see a significant, like a meaningful transformative difference in racing performance is actually much greater than that, which is kind of like, I think, reflective of like how challenging it is to get good at this stuff, and why a lot of people who do have, frankly, probably elite, we would say maybe world-class kind of potential, never get there, because they aren't training with that strategy in mind, and they aren't thinking about and managing that fatigue. And so I think that these beliefs then, and this about this disconnect between theory and practice is sometimes not seen in this way. And I would suggest that I think the normal view is to say that there's an inherent disconnect between theory and practice. And Steve Magnus has a book, The Science of Running, and in the introduction, I think one of the things he talks about is this idea that in the lab, that sports physiologists, exercise physiologists are trying to identify how to train, and that coaches are doing stuff more based on like observed patterns of response to their interventions, and that there's this like disconnect between these two groups, and that coaches are oftentimes more so innovative in terms of like that's really where you see new training practices being developed. And that I think that kind of observational thing, which I'm not saying there isn't some validity to that in terms of like what the body of aggregate evidence of what goes on in sport. I think that does evidence that conclusion to be true, but I also think that that kind of stuff is a part of a broader belief that we have in society in general, that there's a disconnect between like theory and then what's real, and that theory is something that's not real, and that people who develop theories lack a level of understanding. And as a teacher, I teach a course where we talk about the sort of historical, cultural, and social impact of the development in the history of the science of biology, the theory of evolution. And one of the things that comes up every single year inevitably with students is this, comment/question of, well, isn't it just a theory? And I don't really know the exact point of origin of that, but that's really out there. This idea that if you put theory in front of something, that it means that it's like probably not really true, or it's like probably not really to be trusted. When really I think that putting the term theory in there is more of a like gesture at the fact that like all of our knowledge is limited. If you look at cosmology, like our concept of the universe has changed drastically, over the last 1,000 years. And the reality is, as strange as this may be to think, we are, the prodigal cavemen, of human society. And that, we still build houses out of wood and stuff like this, and I'm not necessarily saying, and this is getting way off base in some ways, but I'm not saying there's some hyper, technology necessarily thing in the future, but in terms of our levels of potential understanding that we can reach, like the trajectory of the accumulation of knowledge, suggests acceleration. And, it also would imply that the things that we think to be true now are probably, even if they might be true, they probably are so fractional of what the total understanding is to probably be incomplete. And the problem is it's really hard to prove to people that this is the case, because the best way you can prove to them that it's the case is by learning something new. And the whole point of this is that you're trying to frame that we don't have total understanding. And I think, and I've said this on other episodes, but it's relevant in particular to reemphasize here in this episode, that our level of understanding of endurance sport and sports fitness conditioning in general is probably super constrained and super narrow, because that's a very, very recent phenomena in society that we've gotten really interested in this and invested in this. And I would say that we're very much at the bottom of the well, in terms of that, and that that the sunlight, at the top of the well is probably barely a, pinprick, so I think we're really far away from that. However, I don't think that validates this concept that holds that training theory is just sort of irrelevant. I don't think that the disconnect between training models is because theory and practice are just inherently not the same thing. I think in reality, it's certainly the case that the disconnect is a consequence of an inability to understand the concept of training. And I would argue that training is in essence conceptual. And I would say that the theoretical approach to training is something that's done by people in physiology and by coaches all the time. And I think one of the big reasons why it has to be conceptual is because we don't have the ability to structurally anticipate and then account for all the possible variables of fatigue. Now, a really good coach is going to know the athlete, but I have found that you can know the athlete and you can have an awareness, of kind of what are the things that are empowering to them, what are the things that are going to draw them down, but you don't necessarily have the capacity to step in and do anything about that all the time. Because it's not that, you have to, and you should respect people's autonomy. And one of those aspects of autonomy is that you can't always get people to sort of give sports the priority of energy that is necessary, for at least in your estimation, for them to get to what their goal is and or to get to what you perceive to be their potential to be, or what you feel the next logical step in performance might be. That ultimately has to come from ourselves as athletes. And then if we're working with a coach, then that's something that, we have to bring to the table with that relationship, or if we are applying our own understandings and sort of self-coaching, as they say, if we're doing sport in that way, right, then we have to supply our level. We have to have that relationship with the part of us that is invested in sports, where we can be honest with ourselves about what creates those distractions. And it's not to say distractions is not being used as a pejorative. It's just by, structural definition, something that maybe takes us out of the mode or the mindset or the desire to do, the training that is productive, or the training at least that we've defined as productive, right? That must be a distraction, right? It is competed with something to sufficient degree to get us to move in a different direction, right? That's an effective distraction. And I think that when you're looking at this, right, what you have to do is you have to design training conceptually, right? And that training models have to be conceptual, and then trying to articulate to athletes that you coach that, all of this stuff is just like exemplar, right? And based on right now, this is what this could look like. But the probability that you're going to march through this in this manner is very low. And additionally, the probability that marching through it in this exact manner is going to be the most effective way to ultimately actually execute it is also false, because of the variability of fatigue and circumstance. And there are people whom, get crushed out. Their enthusiasm or their focus or their potential gets crushed out by all kinds of things. And that's fine, right? If genuinely that is fine. If people are healthy and they're fulfilled and they're satisfied with their choices, then there's nothing wrong with that, right? There is no inherent obligation to try to find your ceiling as an athletic performer. Okay. Having said that, it's also the case that self-actualization, self-esteem are defined needs, and that athletics is a huge space in which we get that to happen. And it's also the case that, athletics is like a very, valuable, healthy thing for us to do. So there's also the weighing of when we lose an opportunity to engage in that does potentially have a negative or an adverse effect, right? But, again, individual autonomy is important. So it's true then, right, that the concepts we're going to lay out initially are not going to work. But if it's a good concept, then functionally we're going to be able to be adaptive. And what are we adapting to, right? We're talking about being adaptive in response to fatigue. Usually I think people want to default to whatever they perceive to be the most efficient when they're trying to achieve a given aim. And our perception of efficaciousness is very important to this. And that, again, the subscription to this model that says that intellectual is inherently going to be more ineffective and imprecise. And it's also like in American culture in particular, I think we have this embedded anti-technocracy, attitude, and it's tied up with these ideas of frontiersmanship and rugged individualism, which it's not really so much about like being like you're independent and self-sufficient as much as people think. I think it's more about the idea that like you're capable of understanding everything as well as it's possible and necessary to understand stuff. And that expertise is just an attempt to pull the wool over your eyes, exploit you, and pick your pocket, which is wrong. But that seems to be, very much there, right? So this natural know-how is this thing that we tend to gravitate towards. And I think that's why people like seeing stuff on social media where they have people who seem like they're not trying to be expert. They just seem like they're fellow, sojourners in the pursuit of athletic achievement, I guess. And then they say they drink baking soda. And then we say, oh, well, we should drink baking soda, right? But the reality is these ideas are trickling out of stuff that people read on the internet because they're reading stuff that actually is coming from intellectual and academic spaces, and then they don't have the skills or the practice yet to actually interpret that stuff effectively, right? So this natural know-how thing is, I think hyper limited. And I think the difference is that we already recognize the limitations of, intellectual perspective, right? That we know there's ineffectiveness there, but there's also ineffectiveness to this sort of like, well, this is what, Honky Tonk Hank thinks is the case. And, he's been running for 20 years or 50 years. And so he knows what's up with the what's up. And you can be coaching, for decades and basically know absolutely nothing. And you can coach for a year and you can be more competent, right? But where do we assign and identify competence, right? When we don't necessarily know what it looks like ourselves, it's really challenging. And I think that, the challenge of implementing any approach to training is something that requires a lot more thinking and consideration and strategy than people are popularly willing to accept, because I think there's this sense that if you accept that strategy is needed, then you're accepting this measure of inaccessibility. And obviously there's not inaccessibility because people do this, but I think the reality is we have to develop our level of understanding. And I think that, by recording, these podcast episodes and doing this podcast, I suppose I am actively trying to do, battle with the notion that this stuff is just very simple and, people make it needlessly complicated. And, the nice thing is that we can decide what we want to listen to and consume. And, obviously we know that if you say a bunch of stupid bullshit, people love that. And then if you try to go into stuff with greater levels of accuracy or consideration, you end up turning a lot of people off. Why? Because, well, that person is using words that I don't understand because they're more than one syllable, so they probably are not trustworthy, that kind of thing. And, I'm not interested in trying to, persuade people to see this stuff differently, but I am interested in commenting on the structure and the dynamics of this stuff as I see it play out, because I think it's really fascinating. And I think cumulatively, what this leads to is that fatigue is not really being identified and understood. And I think that's because structurally, we're oftentimes forced into competition when talking about training and how we think we should be training. And, like this podcast is not like highly influential, right? As anybody, who listens to it is aware that, this isn't you're not going to encounter somebody on the street who listens to this podcast in all probability. And I am fine with that personally. I'm not looking to cultivate an audience, or I guess a community. I'm not really, that's not what my interest is. My interest is in, talking through my ideas and perspective. And, I find it very beneficial and helpful for me because it gives me a chance to to be metacognitive in a way that I wouldn't necessarily probably be able to do otherwise. So that's the value I get from this. And let's say, though, that I wanted the podcast to sort of try to gain popular traction or relevance. Well, I think what you then start to move into is this idea that you are going to be forced into competition to do that, right? You don't like put information out there that's useful and effective, and then it's proportionally engaged with. You're competing. And I think that what we usually see is that this kind of competition is defined by maybe one or more different Nash equilibriums, which is, the phenomenon where competitors try to be as close as possible to each other in strategy in order to gain advantage. And this is why people are able to gain traction in social media spaces by simply repeating the same things, cutting edits in the exact same style, using the exact same approach of repeated plot climaxing tensions like every 60 to 90 seconds, and their 10 to 20 minute YouTube videos and vlogs, and everything is constantly building towards these little micro climaxes of, now we're going to say this profound thing, we have this profound thing, right? And all that's a product of editing, but that's all being done to keep close to the competition, right? So the competition in those spaces isn't competition in terms of, well, who has the best strategy for training. The competition is who has the best strategy for getting people to listen to them, getting people to watch what they're doing. And so then what is driving and determining the way we talk about training, the way we talk about the difference between training plans and then how people actually implement training, what is being talked about, or I would argue not talked about in terms of fatigue, has to do with audience, right? And it has to do with consumption. And people don't want to consume, for example, me being like, oh, you know what? I think it's important to really take it easy a lot. And as an example of that, today I'm going to go run for 70 minutes. And hey, look at that. I did 11-minute pace. That's great. Very easy, very relaxed, zero additional muscular fatigue. Nobody's going to look at that because that's not what we want to see. We know we want to see heroics, right? And so this is shaping our concept of fatigue as a consequence. It's this notion of, okay, like, hey, let me represent to you that I have incredible fatigue and I'm doing this stuff anyway, right? I'm not going to let this hold me back. Well, that's exciting right now because we're seeing somebody do something that's unique, that defies our reasonable expectations based on personal experience. Because guess what? When we're really tired, whether it's muscular fatigue, whether it's like we're sleepy, whether it's our brain, it's just sort of temporarily feels short-circuited from maybe working on a project, or doing something that required a lot of, metaphorically speaking, mental bandwidth during the day, then it's hard to do that. So we start to create this notion that fatigue is something that we overcome, not something that we engage with or we listen to, or that's like actually a really important metric. And you know what? If you do, you can get a whoop and then you don't have to think about it. And you can just do whatever the whoop says. I actually don't agree with that. I think the whoop is basically a piece of shit. So, I think, right, when we start to recognize the dynamics of this competition, we start to recognize that it's going to shape how we see training. And then a huge part of that is how we see fatigue. And, I think I've staked out on this podcast effectively by natural consequence of the fact that when you make any series of interpretations or conclusions that are related to any sort of generally focused topic, I've staked out a position that is very far away from the competition. These aren't the kinds of things that you're seeing people present, right? And this is also long form, deep dive approach to this stuff too, right? And so there's this other concept in culture right now that, people won't consume anything longer than blank. Well, I don't think that's true. I think if people aren't really interested in something, they might give it 30 seconds of their attention. I think that's always been the case. It's just that like we now don't have an expectation that people should force themselves to sit and sit still and let themselves be exposed to that. The reality is they're still not really consuming or getting anything out of that. We just had the illusion that they were because they were present, but they were not mentally present or engaged. So there's a variety of things that essentially defeat that possibility. And so then that means, as a consequence, if you're following what I'm saying here, that like it's extremely difficult to try to shift perceptions around this stuff. And then because we're constantly getting inundated with these Nash equilibriums that are driving narrative and interpretation and representation of how to train, these things that we talk about on this podcast appear wrong to people because they're outside of the consensus, but the consensus is a result of this game theory behavior. It's not a result of what's actually effective. Now, as I said, I'm not particularly concerned by the fact that, I'm not going to compete effectively against those entities, except to the extent that it matters to me that by virtue of being so far removed from the competition, that that these like theories and concepts of training practice that I'm argue in favor of across all the episodes that we have on the podcast so far and going forward, they're essentially being marginalized, right? And it's really interesting to observe how ideas are sorted out in society, right? That they're sorted out by these sort of competitive processes, right? It's a market determination. It's not a strategic validation or strategic practice, right? Or because I'm not an Olympic trials qualifier, or I'm not a former world tour cyclist, or I don't meet that minimum threshold of personal achievement, right? That's another factor that people use to leverage that sort of, I guess people like to say engagement with their community. Right? We've got these, nice special terminology to refer to that kind of stuff now. So if we're going to then try to encapsulate this and sort of coin a phrase here, I think this defining Nash equilibrium in this instance is what I'm going to call the proportional adversity postulate. And by this, I mean that competitors for engagement hover around creating a narrative which focuses on the idea that for every action, there is an equal and opposite reaction. And this weird application of Newtonian physics also seems to be used to justify the concept of training as like a perpetual motion machine. And has had been discussed and picked apart at length on this podcast and a number of other episodes. This is then the notion of this mind-body duality, and that we simply achieve more, the greater to which we overcome the body's reluctance, the brain's weakness, we overcome it with this other part of ourselves. And the more we overcome, the more we, celebrate and bring forward our inner athlete and repress the baser, weaker part of our nature. Because obviously the body, which has been evolving over billions of years, definitely is not going to send out any kinds of signals in response to just experienced stress, whether it's environmental stress or whether it's self-induced stress that would be worth listening to. Of course, we should not pay any attention to that. We should repress the living crap out of that information. I'm being sarcastic for those of you who can't tell. So people talk about the algorithm, right? And, as a thing they make the blood sacrifice to. And I'm not saying that media isn't driven by, mathematical models determining, what content goes to what accounts, et cetera. But it's really ultimately more so reflective of the behavior of the Nash equilibrium. And in this case, you have to engage in the proportional adversity postulate model, which is showing people that you grind and then you gain, right? And it's, no pain, no gain as a concept predated the algorithm. It's just the algorithm just sort of, is kind of engaging with the reality of the Nash equilibrium. And I understand the desire to compete for attention for the consumer is basic economic sense. And it's also the only way by which most of us can measure our sense of self-actualization, right? If people are, engaging with what you're producing, if you feel that you have a community around the stuff that you're putting out there, that can be validating. And I think that's fine. I don't mean to minimize that. And I think engaging, an audience and entertaining, I think that's great in and of itself. And for my part, I certainly also think self-actualization is important. And for me, I think though that's more about, I like to try to solve these puzzles, on paper and then see if I can solve them in practice. I like to say, well, how can I connect that, the theory to practice, right? How can I navigate that development and implementation of the training concept? And, how can I seek out opportunities to sort of allow mistakes to happen and then, use that new information to continue to, develop my understanding, right? And I think to be fair, sometimes I've solved some of these things in practice in the past, but, it's fun to solve these puzzles again and again. And, there's always new variables, right? You always need to have an adaptive approach to strategy because different things are going to play out. And so my competition, my competitive muse, if you will, is unlocking, on an individual level, athletically, what can we recognize as the connection between these concepts of training and the actual practice of training. And that's what I, find rewarding. And it's been very interesting because I feel I'm continuing to discover layers and layers of my own mind and my own relationship to training and practice. And, each of these layers oftentimes are representing something that I need to essentially unteach myself. And, that's been a really interesting process and challenge. And that's what's brought me back to this thought of this thing about fatigue that I've been thinking about a lot since I, posted the previous episode in the podcast. And I've begun to suspect this is very true in the concept of my own threshold training and practice, because I think the layer that I'm, struggling to unteach myself is that it's very difficult to resist the good feeling that comes with training too hard, in some cases way too hard. And that I previously defined training too hard as just basically training at what now I'm thinking of as really was the point of physical failure. And I didn't learn initially to perceive that as the point of physical failure because it wasn't respected velocity in the training environments that I was a part of, right? So it doesn't matter how hard you're training. If you're not running your mile repeats in 4:45, then the norm within the culture is, well, you're not training hard, right? And it's actually that you don't know how to train hard. And so unlearning these things, and again, right, like I've said, one of the cool things about doing this podcast is I've been metacognitive in ways that I think it would have been challenging for me to get to otherwise. But I'm recognizing that these things are rooted in my mind, and they are constantly pressuring me to react to and respond and assess and make decisions about what is and isn't productive in different ways. And, I think my minimum standard of work, this is my thesis here, I think my minimum standard of work is basically overtraining. And I believe that this is due to the social conditioning and the chronic immersion exposure to social constructs of what good/not good training practices are. And the stuff that we see in terms of what makes it to the forefront, right? This proportional adversity postulate is, I think, actually taking off, in this current wave of, how we generate media, right? What we talk about when we talk about endurance sports is really, I think, driving that perception for other people too. And I think as a consequence, when we recognize this, I think we also need to recognize that it's probably important to try to talk about this and see if we can figure this stuff out and then see how we can apply this. Because I also think that one of the things that's happened is I've had a lot of conversations with people that have been genuinely extremely interesting and rewarding and enjoyable for me. One of the things I wanted to do when I first came up with the idea to do this podcast is my original idea was that I just wanted to have conversations with different people about their experience with training and how they talked about training, and just try to compile a lot of that stuff as kind of an ethnographic perspective. But unfortunately, unfortunately for my goal there anyway, unfortunately I discovered that basically nobody wanted to do that. So as a consequence, it didn't happen. The other thing that has been interesting is I've had a number of different conversations with people, not just in terms of potentially doing a podcast episode and sharing their experience and that not panning out, but also people who've reached out and expressed interest of oh, this is, how can I apply this to my training? How can I do this, that, or the other thing? And what I've found is in some instances I've talked to people and gone back and forth and exchanged some ideas. In other instances, people are asking so many questions, I've just said, look, if you want coaching or planning, I'm happy to give that to you. And some people have been oh yeah, that's great. That's exactly what I want. And then you don't hear anything from them. And it's okay, whatever, right? You're respecting people's autonomy. I'm not doing this to make a fortune or anything like that. So if people change their mind, that's fine, right? No hard feelings. Or you'll have people who you sort of start working with and then they just sort of evaporate. And that's sort of been an interesting experience. And I think it's reflective of the fact that we can on this podcast say, well, we train too hard and, or this concept is broken or this concept is broken and here's how we need to do it. But when we try to put this stuff into practice, it's not working. Okay. And the fact that it's not working, I would like to suggest here, is not because we're not saying the right things, but it's because there's an additional layer to that. And that's where the coaching stuff is important. And, yes, I suppose I would toot my own horn here to some extent, but really just in general, this is where the coach is such an important part of sport, is that a coach, provided they are a good coach, and by implication, what follows is probably also the definition of a good coach, provided they're a good coach, they're going to be able to identify, recognize those issues and basically say that, okay, you understand that you need to maybe reduce it or pull it back, but actually you're not all the way to that concept and understanding because I have mastery over what this needs to be. And, here's what this needs to look like. Let's keep conferencing on it and let's keep building that understanding through experience. And then there's a trial and error process. And if you keep working on that, eventually you're going to get to that point. And I think what people are struggling with is they're struggling with fatigue, both because they're not managing the fatigue correctly in terms of reducing it, or, and I think this is some ways more interesting, is that people start doing this stuff and then they don't like that they're not experiencing enough fatigue or it's not hard enough. And they are then there's all of this other, information or narrative, about well, what is it about? And the idea that you're missing out on something essential, important, meaningful, valuable by not getting absolutely freaking trashed in training sessions. And like, Trainer Road, for example, gives us that, right? Trainer Road gives us that. There used to be this, I don't know if it's still a thing, but there used to be this thing called the Sufferfest, where you could like buy these like cycling race montages, and they would like prompt you through some like ridiculous workout, right? And you could do it, but it was basically like this all-out race effort. It wasn't like repeatable, right? But it was just like suffer, suffer, suffer. And so then like you take that away from people, and getting people to like accept that that's what they need to do. And like people like the idea of, oh, okay, so I can feel better. But I think that in practice, we're struggling with that. So I hope that this episode and then subsequent episodes are going to help to like explore that a little bit more. And if you are sort of struggling to navigate this and you want to, reach out, you can message us on the Instagram page at Black Cats Run. I'm always happy to chat with people, and it's helpful to me too to hear what people are wondering about, because that oftentimes gives me ideas of what would be interesting to explore or talk about in the podcast. So that's the other thing that I really value with talking to people, is it's prompted me to look at stuff with different perspectives and get interested in other questions, which has also been really informative for me. So what do we want? Where do we want to go from here? So I think that we can probably recognize and maybe agree, and of course you as a listener are silent, so I'm going to take your silence as consensus. And I think we can reach a consensus that like there is still widespread congregation around the basic strategy of training being like, it's so freaking hard. You can watch Lionel Sanders' YouTube video from this past week of his mile repeats and what he talks about in there, right? And I think that's a great example of, I don't mean this as a criticism. I just mean this as an observation. And I think that a lot of people struggle with this, right? Including myself. But I think, what you see in that is this like regression back to this concept of like, it doesn't feel hard enough. Like if I don't feel like I'm at this thing that my brain is telling me is this sort of like outer boundary, I'm not going to get better. So what we're going to talk about next is we're going to talk about overtraining. We're going to talk about productivity. We're going to talk about load management. We're going to talk about rest, what rest actually means. Talk about blood bonking. Going to talk about identifying a regression and then reaching some conclusions. And I think we'll spread this out over a couple of other episodes instead of throwing this down on like a 2.5 to 3 hour episode. So what I would leave you with here as like an incentive to listen to the subsequent forthcoming episodes is that fatigue is something that we both struggle to understand in terms of we need to first like reduce it sufficiently to train effectively, but also we struggle with it because fatigue is essentially the adversity that we overcome. And when you take away that kind of adversity, you take away a huge part of how people feel like they're overcoming on a regular basis. And for most of us, we're never going to get to the level where we're going to be qualifying for major, like, I'm not talking about the Boston Marathon, right? I'm talking about like legitimate, like big deal, like high level competitions. Some of us do. But I would suspect that probably most of the people who are listening to this podcast are not, sponsored international athletes, because if you're at that level, those people would probably not be inclined to be trusting, of this voice or of this perspective, because it's not saying what their entire environment and world around them is built on, which is that they are special. They're more special than us because of their capacity to resist fatigue and suffering in training. So when we play this out, right, how do we train effectively? Jillian Bennett, cyclist, one of the things I used to talk to her about in training was that I think it would be helpful, if we periodically did something that's like really challenging and rewarding, because I think that has a positive impact on your level of engagement. And those things need to be frequent enough to keep us liking what we're doing, feeling good about ourselves because of what we're doing. But they also need to be infrequent enough that they're not like just dominating what we're doing with massive amounts of training. And one of the things that I would do with her is we would go out in the winter, and we did this for a couple years, where we'd go out in the winter and we periodically go out and run these 50-kilometer runs. And they were usually like extremely hilly runs on, dirt roads and, ice and snow. And there's a lot of like dehydration and stuff like that. And is that stuff incredible, awesome, precise training? Probably not. But is it like levering, a ridiculous amount of fatigue that has a negative effect on training for a while? Definitely. But it's like this conundrum or this paradox that like, unless we like expose ourselves to and grapple with that fatigue, sometimes it just kind of all becomes sort of like meaningless, right? And it's not that we want to like suffer and be uncomfortable. It's that we want to feel competent, and we can't feel competent unless like we're overcoming a level of challenge, right? There's that kind of like sweet spot there. But that amount of fatigue that we do battle with to feel good, to get that the greatest level of edification, is not the basis on which we want to like be designing training efforts. And I think there's too much of that goes on. And I think so much of what we see currently in social media representations of this stuff suggests that that's kind of what people do all of the time. And it leaves us really lost and confused. And so then even if we try to pull back, like we still don't really know how to pull back. And I think as a consequence, and this is what I'm going to talk about in the next episode to start, I think probably 90 to 95% of people who do endurance sports, from the amateur of amateurs, elite amateurs, sub-elites, and world-class professionals, I think 90-95% of people are overtrained. Thanks for listening to today's episode. If you've enjoyed this or other episodes, you can check us out on our Instagram page at Black Cats Run. Send us a DM if you have anything that you're wondering about or you have a perspective that you would like to share. Always happy to hear those and happy to then turn those and represent those on future podcast episodes. If you can think of anybody else in your life who would find any of this stuff meaningful and rewarding to listen to while they're folding the laundry, mowing the lawn, running on the treadmill, riding their bicycle on a trainer on Zwift, send them a link to our podcast. We'll catch you next time.